From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And in today's lineup, K-State's DeAnn Presley will talk about identifying soil compaction problems in crop fields during and following this fall harvest. She offers some thoughts on navigating fields during harvest to minimize the chances of compacting soils. Then K-State's Terry Griffin will discuss some of the current thinking on the ownership of farm data and whether you producers would be wise to go off the grid with your data. He maintains that the value of that data diminishes greatly by isolating it in an attempt to keep it private. And further ahead, this week's K-State Horticulture segment, where Jason Griffin offers guidelines on selecting and planting landscape trees here in the fall. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and as we're into the fall crop harvest in Kansas, some thoughts for you growers to keep well in mind about soil compaction potential in your fields. Along with us now is a soil management specialist with K-State Research and Extension, DeAnn Presley, to visit about some of the things that we often misjudge about the compaction potential out in our fields, DeAnn. And this still continues to be a concern for some producers.
Yes, it can. Sometimes it's a little more obvious than others. So sometimes compaction, historical compaction, might be more visible in a dry year. So if you think about it, plant roots, as they're going into the soil, they're using water and they're getting nutrients out of the soil. Well, in a dry year, compacted soils will, hurt that plant quite a bit because they aren't able to get enough. Like they can't get down, and if there's a layer, they can turn and go sideways, but they can also, relatively speaking, plant roots have an easier time traveling through and getting through a moist soil versus a dry soil. So you can see a lot of suffering of plants due to compaction when it's either really, really dry or when it's quite wet, if you have water ponding, and that's, obviously going to be too much of a good thing. Too much water, you get a lot of nitrogen loss in waterlogged soils too. So in a perfect year, you may not see much compaction or signs of compaction.
If one was to use a soil probe to measure compaction, what would be the indicator that, yes, there is a problem that needs to be addressed?
So, first of all, the thing about using one of those penetrometers, if you get one that's got a gauge, so actually a lot of our extension offices will have those, and I think some crop consultants have them as well. The ones that are made, that have a gauge on that, they'll actually have a green zone, a yellow zone, and a red zone. So there's a Penn State researcher I know that has written an article that says anything over 300 psi is too much, and plant roots can't, get through 303 psi at all. But in a dry year, a plant might be just as stressed out at 250 psi. So the other thing that a lot of soil scientists, or struggle with those penetrometers is what's the exact right moisture content to push it into the ground. It's supposed to be at field capacity, which is after you've had a nice soaking rain, let it drain for a couple days, then go out and check it. Well, tell me when that happens, and I'll tell you when to go. Right. It's a little hard to time that perfect. So that's one reason I'm not a huge fan of the penetrometer. And the other thing is if you just go poke a penetrometer in the ground and don't dig a hole or don't take a soil core with it, how do you know you're just not hitting something,
a rock.
Different. You could be hitting a rock, hitting a different soil texture. Maybe it's you've got sand over clay or clay over sand. Either one of those is going to feel different to you. And then also dryness too. So go out and try to soil, core on a day where it's, after it's been dry for a few weeks, you can't get that probe in the ground. Do it again after, like a week after rain. Goes in like butter. So moisture matters a lot when you're just pushing something in the ground. So I prefer just taking out a spade and digging a hole. dig a hole down 6 to 12 inches and, get it maybe a few shovel widths wide so that you can just see what are the plant roots doing. Mm-hmm. That's the best indicator. Was the plant stressed out or not? So then, look in different parts of the field. End rows are obviously going to be a good spot for comparison to say, oh, yeah, those roots are knobby, twisted, whatever. So this is what you're looking for is just poor root growth, twisted, but they also tend to be malformed and kind of stubby looking. And the other thing to think about is patterns. So if you think about what causes compaction, you're like, well, there's lots of different choices here. So surface compaction, that's going to be from just any kind of tire, foot traffic. So if cattle traffic it, generally that's pretty shallow that goes to. But then you could have old tillage pans in a soil that can be persistent for many, many years. And I shouldn't say old. I guess they could be current tillage pans too. And those are going to look like kind of a line going across, pretty consistent. And it'll be maybe an inch below the depth of tillage. So when I say line, I mean you can imagine that line going across. Deep compaction comes from heavy, heavy things. Looking at that pattern of compaction, what does it look like? Are there stripes that correspond to something? Is it, if it's across the whole field, that's probably more tillage implement related. Yeah, so the patterns matter with compaction a lot.
In an article that you just put together on this topic in the E-Update series, you expressed that most folks tend to underestimate the downward pressure that a load of something, or merely the implement itself in the case of a combine, will bring to bear on that soil and therefore lead to compaction.
Yes, so there is a lot of great tire technology going on. There's a lot of work. The companies that are out there do lots of work on, tracks and different kinds of tires and what the proper inflation pressures are for those tires. And that's great. That helps with the surface compaction. But if you think about the force exerted by anything, it does go somewhere and it does go into the ground. And so there's some great European work I've seen on this where they can bury sensors in the ground and how much pressure is it being, how much force is going into the ground and how far. That's a great question, right? How far is it going in the ground? Well, it's going to vary from soil to soil, a sandy soil versus a clay soil versus a silty soil, and what moisture content you're probably thinking. Yes, all those things matter a lot. But what researcher after researcher has found is anything over 10 tons on one axle starts to take away yield, 10 tons per axle. And you do the math on a lot of different things actually weigh quite a bit. Grain carts are the easy one to point at and say, wow, because you can do the math pretty quick on those. How many bushel grain cart times pounds per bushel, how many axles. So, more axles is definitely better. That's going to help spread out a load. So more axles, more tires.
And as producers go about harvest with combines, which even empty might be heavy enough to lend to compaction, grain carts for sure, or trucks, they need to at least minimize the repeated traffic over specific spots in the field. Is that step number one?
Yeah, so there's sort of two trains of thought on that. So there were some Australian farmers that were here visiting this summer, and they were asking about controlled traffic farming and how many farmers do controlled traffic farming. So that's where it's a big thing in Australia where they'll set up, they're called tram lines in Europe, but they'll have basically areas in the field that they always drive on, and then the rest of the field never has a tire on it. So when they, buy equipment or replace equipment, they're putting things on those same footprint, so they're always running over the same area. So they don't expect yield to be great in those areas. But then the benefit is that they get all of that area in between that never has a tire track on it. So is it better to run over the whole field evenly, or is it better just to have roads, little paths in the field? I don't really literally mean roads, but I just mean solid areas you can always drive on. So it's two trains of thought there. I don't have any research on, and I haven't read enough research on there to know pros and cons. But in talking with those Australian farmers a little bit more about why is it so important, why is it such a thing, why is it a common practice there? When they got to talking about their soils, well, they're really, really clayey. That's the only way that this kind of works for them, is to preserve the soil structure so that it can capture water instead of all the water running off in those areas. And then they've got these areas that have kind of been built up. So maybe it's a site-specific thing, meaning I don't mean precision ag, I mean a specific to place sort of thing, how important it is. But I have heard of a few farmers in Kansas doing it, and I think in terms of if you're trying to build soil structure, it's going to work if you wanted to set up and do it. And then people are like, well, what happens if those tram lines go downhill? Well, like, yeah, you'd pretty much have to farm on the contour to make that system work out pretty well. But I know people aren't going to park grain carts. That's fine. I understand why everybody uses grain carts. Just saying, don't be surprised if you're giving up some yield potential there as well. So maybe it'd be nice to know what that yield potential loss is. And is tillage the only option? No. Reducing traffic is another option. So it's not the only option, that's what I'm saying. So if you're a long-term no-tiller, do you need to go get out tillage equipment? Well, one interesting study that was done in western Kansas, and also there was a site in Colorado and Nebraska, but they found in comparing, a lot of these long-term research projects where they've got tillage and maybe they have conventional till, reduced till, no-till. Well, one of the things you can do is you can go take that soil and do that Proctor compactability test, and every time the no-till soil is less compactable, you can traffic the soil wetter and cause less compaction than you do on a soil that has little structure that you've fluffed up with tillage. So that's the nice thing, is the longer the no-till system is in place, you can actually do a better job resisting compaction. The soil has more strength as it's built structure. So that's the good thing. So it's especially if you've gotten one of these nice soaking good rains lately and you can't get in the field to harvest something, taking a shovel out or taking out a rod of any kind, so a moisture rod that some people have with that little ball on the end, just see how far down you can slide it.
It's important for producers to recognize and identify compaction issues in their fields and be aware that might be contributing to whatever yield shortcomings you have in a given field. There's a good article on this topic, again, in one of the recent e-update newsletters out of K-State, dated September the 15th, on tips to avoid subsoil compaction during row crop harvest. Have a look at that. DeAnn, we appreciate the comments.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
She is a soil management specialist with K-State Research and Extension, DeAnn Presley, along with us on this part of Agriculture Today. We'll have more after these moments away on the K-State Radio Network. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Welcome back. We'll talk precision agriculture once more and address some questions that linger still about all of that data that you producers collect with your precision technologies and the utilization of that data to your best benefit. Along with us once more is Terry Griffin. He's a precision agricultural economist, K-State Research and Extension. Terry is posting regularly now information via the blog format on the agmanager.info website about data and some of these questions that continue to swirl around that topic, Terry. And one of the things that you continue to come back to and you're hearing from farmers about still is the ownership of farm data. Who owns that data? And this is a complicated matter, isn't it?
It's very complicated, and a lot of people were asking this question, and it seems like everybody knows what answer they want to hear, but unfortunately that's not the answer that we're providing to them. Data is not like the things that we're used to talking about owning, like farmland and grain and tractors and those tangible goods. We know what it means to own those, and there's a legal definition, and there's some economics of public goods and private goods and definitions there. But ag attorneys explained to us that the legal definitions do not really apply to intangible digital data like they do to tangible things like grain and livestock and land. And furthermore, the point I try to make in this blog is focus on the economics of it. There's private goods and there's public goods. Private good will be those things we just mentioned, things that you own as a person. Public goods are not owned by a person, but you think of these as national defense, okay? So the government provides national defense, and it provides it almost equally. There's none of us that can enjoy that more than others, or more to the point, there's no way that I can exclude you from enjoying the same national defense because it's a public good. Well, where does farm data fall? I mean, is it a private good? Is it a public good? Well, it's not. It's not a public good, but it doesn't have all the characteristics of a private good either.
So it's in limbo, in effect, or?
Yeah, sort of in limbo. And, I think eventually we can own farm data, but I think it's going to take some legislation probably at the federal level. And I think that's what farmers are implicitly asking for is, please give us federal legislation such that we own and have ownership rights of our data that's generated from our farm. So, the question really should be, can I exclude others from accessing the data?
Controlling access.
Can I control access to this data? And we can do that until we start sharing it. So that's where the caveat is, because for the most part, farm data has value, but that value is usually limited to that field, to that farm, and maybe to the next field over, but there's a really strong distance decay going on. So the further away from the field you consider, the lower the value is going to be. Well, if that's the case, when farm data is aggregated with a lot more farm data from across large regions, the value is exponentially greater than when it's isolated to a given farm. Well, the thing about that in terms of ownership and sharing, can you own or at least can you control farm data? Yes, unless you share it with a bunch of other people. Can you benefit from that farm data? Yes, but you probably have to share it with a bunch of other people.
Mm-hmm. There is a much, much greater value to the data if, in fact, it is integrated with data from elsewhere, and that's just the reality of it, right?
Sure thing. The analogy that, well, in this case, I'm going to give credit to Alex Schnoen, who is a co-author on one of the blog articles, actually the one termed Is Going Off the Grid Possible? Mm-hmm. And the analogy that we come up with was mechanized agriculture. So, at one point, plows and planters and harvesters were, if they were mechanical, they were being drawn by animal power, horses or oxen or whatever the local area may be. And when mechanized tractors became available, farmers had a choice to make. And many chose to remain with animal power, and some chose to go with mechanized tractors. And in doing so, they implicitly decided to give up some of their self-sufficiency, some independence to, let's say, diesel, the fuel providers. Okay, so now these farmers that were almost entirely self-sufficient are now relying upon a third-party fuel provider for the equipment. So they're not as independent as they were before. Well, the farmers who decided to maintain their self-sufficiency, their independence, were the ones who were using animal power. Well, fast forward to today, where is our animal-powered farms at?
Non-existent.
And you can draw the same parallels with farm data utilization. If used correctly, it will make farms more efficient. Not all farms will be more efficient from using this. You probably heard me say before when we talk about yield monitor data that it's not for everybody. So you take a poor manager, someone who's barely able to keep production going, adding a layer of complexity is not going to make the farm more efficient. Well, this is the same idea, just an extrapolation of that. It will add a layer of complexity, but for those managers who know how to make the most of it, they will have a competitive advantage against their peers.
And this term that you bring up, again, that's the theme of the other blog article you posted on agmanager.info. You have producers asking about the idea of, as you put it, going off the grid, basically stepping away from the interaction. Is that what that means?
Yeah, the question that we're getting is, we're talking about big data in the last few years, maybe last 5 years now, starting in about 2012. I've been talking about what I would consider small data for 20 years, yield monitor data, soil data, variable rate applications on a given field. I call that small data if that data is kept at that field level or that farm. And now that I'm talking about big data, I've had a lot of folks come to me and say, okay, we've been hearing you talking about data for a long time, and now you're talking about big data. Well, let's revisit the small data. I think we're ready to start with that. And then you have another group of people who are like, I'm just going to not do this. I'm going to avoid going on the grid. I'm going to avoid participating in any data systems, and I'm just not going to play ball. And that's fine, with the exception of it may not be that possible because, for instance, since 2011, most tractors are coming equipped with what would be analogous to OnStar in our GM vehicles that are collecting data and pushing that data back to the manufacturers. Well, there's not necessarily an opt-out of that. So, even small farms have newish equipment, and some of them may even buy used equipment that's new enough that the telematics or this pushing wireless data back to the manufacturer exists. And so, they're kind of on the grid.
You are making a concerted effort to get these messages out through these blogs you're posting and addressing these and likely other questions about data management that are coming down the line then, right?
Yeah, so the first blog post that I put up was addressing the question of, is farm data considered big data? Well, farm data is big data, and not only that, but some of the characteristics of big data, farm data is the poster child for that. Messiness is a characteristic of big data. Well, anyone's tried to work with file formats from different manufacturers, different proprietary platforms of data would know that, ag data is messy, and it's a really good example of big data.
Yeah. And the idea of being anonymous in this whole data management scheme is unrealistic at this point.
Sure. We all would like to remain anonymous, but any of us that have a smartphone, we talk about smartphones a lot and use them, and on campus, I wish students would look up from them, and especially when they're crossing the street, because that just scares me. We've given up that right a long time ago. Google Maps, we use it because it makes life better, it gets us turn directions. But you know what? We're relinquishing a lot of information when we use it. But it's worth it, right? The benefits of getting good turn-by-turn directions outweigh the cost that the privacy that we give up. In today's world, anonymity, being anonymous, isn't possible like it once was. And the idea is you can sanitize data sets. And in a world of truly big data, it only takes maybe one or two layers more data added back to that to figure out who the original people were. In agriculture, we think of plat maps, publicly available, who owns land. We know the USDA has a lot of public data, whether it's production at the county level. We have a lot of the FSA data that's very specific on who received subsidies. RMA data is available at the county level. And we put some of these layers together, we can kind of sort out who's who. So, and it's not a bad thing. It's just something we need to accept and move forward, that, anonymity is not really attainable like it once was.
You are putting out some enlightening perspectives on this whole issue of farm data, how to perceive it in your overall management and how to use it most effectively. And that is going to continue on the agmanager.info website, so we'd invite folks to check out your regular postings there, Terry. Thanks for going over all of this with us today. We always appreciate your time.
Thanks, Eric.
Speaking here with Terry Griffin, Precision Agricultural Economist, K-State Research and Extension. Again, check out his entries on agmanager.info. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll break away now and be back with more after this over the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to the Thursday edition of Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you as we continue on now with today's agricultural news headlines. These courtesy in part of DTN. Congressional Republicans released their framework for tax reform yesterday, and Senator Charles Grassley of Iowa, a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, told reporters that overhauling the tax code presents a real opportunity for rural America, in his words. The Washington Post had reported the top tax rate for individuals of 39.6% will be lowered to 35% under this plan. When asked by DTN if the tax cuts would later force spending cuts in the Farm Bill, Grassley said the Farm Bill and tax cuts are separate items, and cuts to the Farm Bill would not be expected because of the lower revenue. Instead, the senator said higher economic growth from the tax cuts would generate higher federal revenue based on the proposition that if we have just 0.25% of increase in gross domestic product, it will make up for what is cut, according to Grassley. Among the specific changes that Grassley wants to see in that final tax bill is for Congress to transfer the benefit of the $1 a gallon biodiesel tax credit, a plan he and another senator proposed earlier this year would switch the beneficiary of that tax credit so domestic biodiesel producers receive the credit rather than companies that blend. There have been ongoing problems with companies collecting the tax credit on imported biodiesel. On another topic, Grassley said he wants to ensure the estate tax is repealed. He said that tax, as he sees it, is a burden for producers. Farm assets generally make up about 2.5% of all assets taxed under the estate tax, but farm groups have emphasized the need to eliminate that tax, which generates about $17 billion a year in federal revenue. And Grassley said there was talk last week that Republicans might abandon that estate tax repeal. He said he thinks elimination of the tax is, though, still on the table. The big issue, if lawmakers choose to eliminate the estate tax, is what Congress would do then about the basis of the inherited assets. Heirs now receive stepped-up basis for those assets. Grassley said there are questions about what would happen because such assets, when sold, could be subject to capital gains. He added it's important to preserve some other tax breaks for farmers, such as Section 179 business expensing to purchase equipment. Well, beef continues to bolster Cargill's financial results with high consumer demand and ample cattle supply helping that company's bottom line. The Minnesota-based conglomerate reported a profit of $973 million for the first quarter of its fiscal year 2018, which ended on August the 31st. That's a 14% gain from the same period a year ago. The protein business for Cargill carrying its momentum from last year. Its food ingredient business was its second largest contributor to financial gains. The company's origination and processing business, though, was down from last year's strong comparative quarter. While global demand for grain and oil continues to grow, Cargill said an overabundance of production during the last 4 crop cycles has depressed commodity prices and market volatility. And the Director of Congressional Relations for the American Farm Bureau says it's probably a reach to believe the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement will be finalized by the end of this year. Dave Salmonson told Brownfield Ag Network that trade officials from the U.S., Canada, and Mexico are working hard to come to an agreement using an accelerated schedule. He said most issues are on the table, but tough negotiations lie ahead. Salmonson views dispute settlement, rules on origin in the manufacturing sector, and Canada's supply management system for dairy and poultry as some of the bigger sticking points. The third round of NAFTA negotiations concluded yesterday in Ottawa, Canada. You're listening to Agriculture Today. For you now, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. And with that is Greg Akagi. Greg?
Sherry Seifer, Kansas Soybean Commission's educational consultant, joins us. And Sherry, you were one of the judges at this year's Invent a Heart Healthy Food competition at the Kansas State Fair. What is the competition all about?
Well, it's to educate people on the use of soy foods and the nutritional part of it, and let them know that there is a lot of protein in our soy foods so that they can, they need to substitute some extra protein into anything, any of their foods for people, why There's an easy way to do that, and it's a very nutritional use of food.
You know, this contest sponsored by the Kansas Soybean Commission has really grown here the past several years.
Yes, it has. We keep having more entries each year.
Let's talk about the winners.
Yes, we had some really nice items this year. The ice cream part of it was really neat. That was the first time we'd had any of that. And it was very tasty, and it was something that was done very easily, and you could just put it in your pan and stick it in your refrigerator, and it was very neat.
You also had a cool, crunchy soy wrap that was one of the winners?
Yes, it was. Very easy to make and very, very tasty and really very nutritious, and it would fit into anybody's diet.
And for those of you who like salsa, one of your other winners was an edamame corn salsa.
Yes, nobody turns down a salsa, and that was delicious.
Now, when you're judging this, you're looking for soy products, but that really goes into several different categories.
There's lots of things that you can use for your soy products. Of course, there's soy vegetable oil. It's 100% soybean oil. And you've got your soy butter, which is like a peanut butter, but only it's made from soybeans. Tofu is a good source, which is used a lot. And then your margarines are made with soy. So there's easy ways out there to get your soy incorporated into your food, and we do it every day. And so we just need to actually read our labels and see what we're using, but many more people could get involved with this. And then, of course, edamame is a high source because it's a soybean, and then you've got your regular soybeans that you can get that are canned. You can use in salads. Some of them make hummus out of it, and just different things. And you can add tofu to anything and make it rich in protein. Don't get any flavor of the tofu because it picks up the taste of the food that you put it in.
That is Sherry Seifert, Kansas Soybean Commission's educational consultant, who joins us as she was one of this year's judges at the Invent a Heart Healthy Food Competition at the Kansas State Fair. This has been the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Greg Akagi with the update. Thanks, Greg. And squeezing in a quick calendar item, the Kansas Forest Service here at K-State reminds you that the 23rd annual Fall Forestry Field Day is coming up next week, Wednesday, October the 4th. The location is the Bill Kennedy Tree Farm near Randolph, just north of Manhattan. The program will get going at 9 o'clock in the morning with registration. There'll be a host of topics important to those of you interested in improving your tree resource management. A fine program indeed. There's further information on registration and other details, of course, at www.kansasforests.org, kansasforests.org. This is Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Coming your way next on this Agriculture Today, our weekly K-State Horticulture segment, and it's often touted as one of the best times of the year to plant landscape trees, the fall. And therefore, we'll talk landscape tree planting with our next guest, who is the director of K-State's John C. Pear Horticulture Center just outside of Wichita, Jason Griffin. Jason, this is one of your favorite times of the year with respect to sprucing up the home landscape with new tree selections. So why is fall a preferred planting time?
Well, we've all heard the saying, fall is for planting. The Arbor Day Foundation has made a big push on this in the last several years, and there's actually some science behind it. We step outside and you realize it's cooler. The soil is a little more moist than it was a few weeks ago. So fall is great for planting for a couple of reasons. The environment, the weather is right, cooler temperatures, moist soil. And when we plant trees, the first thing we're thinking about is how do we get roots to grow? Mm-hmm. And the physiology of trees is really interesting in that roots have two primary seasons in which they grow on trees, and that's spring and fall. So by planting in the fall, what we're doing is we're getting fall root growth and we're getting spring root growth before the trees even try to put on new shoot growth. So we've got 2 seasons of root growth before those leaves start demanding water from the soil. So it's really a great time to get out there and plant your trees.
In other words, a tree planted in the fall will come on much more briskly come springtime.
Much more likely to be established and much more likely to have success the following year. That's correct.
About selection of trees for a landscape, do you have general guidelines to go by, or is that just best left to one's own devices?
Well, when we talk about selecting trees for plantings, especially this time of year, people are thinking about fall color. And they want to know what trees they can get for great fall color. So we always recommend, ask your local garden centers, ask your extension folks, ask people who know. And of course, when you're dealing with cultivars, named clones, we generally know what the fall color will be. The intensity of the color can change, but we generally know what color they're going to be. But we still have some trees out there like oaks and Chinese pistache, which are grown from seed, and we never really know for sure what color they're going to be. So fall is also a great time for planting because you can go to the nursery and you can pick out the tree when it's in fall color, and you'll know what it will be from there out.
Fall color is a priority with many, many folks, understandably. You also need to think, though, about the adaptability and durability of that cultivar, do you not?
That is true. And K-State, we have some great publications out there on the KSRE bookstore for recommended trees. The Kansas Forest Service, the Community Forestry Program, has some great regional guides for selecting trees, their preferred tree lists for each region of the state. Those are available. They're easy to read. We make them really user-friendly. Some of them even have great pictures now. So, yeah, there's lots of resources out there for which trees are the best ones for your particular area.
And it might be that one out there would prefer a monoculture, same type of tree in a location, guessing that you'd recommend otherwise a diversity of trees in a given landscape setting.
We certainly do. Can't recommend diversity enough. Just because you drive down the street and you see that all of your neighbors have planted an autumn blaze maple doesn't necessarily mean it's the one you ought to plant. Yes, the fall color is fantastic, but the tree has some liabilities, and we're definitely getting towards monoculture on some of these trees that are so heavily planted. So look for some diversity. Look for something different. And again, that's where your nursery folks, your nursery professionals, and extension folks can really help you out there.
Very good. So folks do utilize those resources to the fullest. About the planting project itself and the location of that tree, where you would place it within the home landscape, must one be somewhat strategic about this, Jason?
Absolutely. Know whether your tree is a large tree, a small tree, medium tree. Again, ask those local experts what size it is. And when you go out there to plant your tree, it looks small. Now, when you bring it home from the nursery and it's a 1-inch or a 2-inch caliper tree and it's only 10 feet tall, if that tree is going to be 60 feet tall at maturity and it's going to be 40 feet around, you've got to be at least 20 feet away from your house. You don't want those branches down the road tearing off your siding or your eaves or anything like that. They can cause a lot of damage if they're too close. Also, you got to look out for power lines. And boy, you certainly have to call the Kansas One call to know what's underground before you start digging holes as well.
And you want to allow for root growth as well. So if you have any underground lines, sewer lines, what have you, why you want to do your level best to avoid growth into those areas.
That's right. Yeah, you don't want those roots plugging up your sewer lines and heaving your sidewalks. And yeah, so definitely give those roots lots of room to grow.
And planting technique, we've visited about that before ad nauseum in this segment, but there are certain things you must keep well in mind when you're planting a tree, the size of the hole, adequate waterings, all of those standards, correct?
That is true. First of all, you have to start with a good tree. You get what you pay for. Mm-hmm. Trees on sale, really, really good sales often aren't really, really good trees. So you start with a good tree. You dig a wide hole, not deep, but a wide hole, because, again, you want those roots to grow. And think about roots growing out, not down. They want to grow out wide, not deep down. So dig a nice big wide hole and get that tree off to a good start.
And then once you place the tree, place it upright, you backfill it, you mulch it, stake it, all of these things, correct?
That's right. Those are all still recommended practices. Yep, stake it if you need to. You're in a windy location, put a firm stake on it. Yep, definitely mulching helps keep the lawnmowers, the weed eaters, helps modify soil temperature, soil moisture. Mulch is a wonderful thing.
Is a planting time fertilization necessary, Jason?
At planting time, do you need to fertilize? That's a really good question, and we go back and forth on that. If you are buying a high-quality tree from a good nursery, the chances are pretty good that tree's been fertilized this year. Okay. So it probably has all the nutrients in it needs. So give it a year before you start to fertilize it.
But by all means, you must keep up regular waterings well into the late fall, if not early winter, do you not?
That is true. Remember, fall and spring are the two seasons for root growth, so you want to have a moist, but not wet, but a moist soil. Even in the winter when the ground is not frozen, we get into these long spells in February where it kind of warms up a little bit. Don't be afraid to give it a little drink.
Again, there is a myriad of information out there K-State Research and Extension provides on landscape tree selection as well as planting, and those local nurseries can certainly lend a hand information-wise as well. Jason, thanks for the comments right here, and we will catch up with you again soon.
Thank you, Eric.
He is the director of K-State's John C. Pear Horticultural Center, and speaking with us from his office in Wichita, that's Jason Griffin. On this week's K-State Horticulture segment. That's our time for today. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.